The Queen usually calls for her politicians. Prime Ministers get an entourage up the Mall to the palace. But the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell yesterday evoked images of a less traditional meeting. If it came to it, he reportedly said at the Edinburgh Fringe yesterday, "I would be sending Jeremy Corbyn in a cab to Buckingham Palace to say we're taking over." So how has it come to this?
Politicians from across the country, from all sides of the House, including the Conservative Party, are looking for almost any way to stop a no-deal Brexit. That means keeping all options on the table, including a vote of no confidence.
Traditionally, if a government lost a no-confidence vote, a Prime Minister might expect to resign. But under the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act, there's a 14-day window in which the incumbent Prime Minister can try to prove they still command the support of the Commons, or else a new majority government can emerge. If neither happens, there's an election. When Boris Johnson's chief aide Dominic Cummings was asked about the idea that his boss would resign in that scenario, he apparently laughed. The big constitutional conundrum comes if Mr Johnson were to stay on, despite someone clearly being able to command a majority of the House. And what would be in it for Boris Johnson to stay on for those 14 days? Well, he'd be able to set the date of an election, past the 31st of October if he wanted, the date for leaving the EU. That would mean he could deliver a no-deal Brexit, despite losing a vote of no confidence. This would put the Queen into a hugely difficult constitutional bind.
The Queen likes to spend her summers in Scotland, but this year she's faced with the prospect of a decision that she would never wish to make. If Boris Johnson loses a vote of no confidence but stays, we know that Jeremy Corbyn would want to form a government with permission from the Queen. The Queen, therefore, would be left in an impossible situation. Does she replace the Prime Minister with Jeremy Corbyn, or does she allow Boris Johnson to continue and set the date of an election?
There's no historical precedent for this scenario, but you only have to look at Australia's constitutional crisis of 1975 to find an example of how the Queen was dragged into politics.
In 1975, Australia faced its own constitutional crisis when the government was unable to get the Parliament to pass the bills needed to pay for things like civil servants' pay, essential services, so the country could have ground to a halt. The Governor-General, who's the Queen's representative in Australia, stepped in, sacked the Prime Minister and appointed the opposition leader as an interim Prime Minister. It damaged all involved, the incoming and outgoing Prime Minister and the Governor-General himself.
A vote of no confidence is still a long way off. One former minister, now Conservative rebel, told me this week that there was a 1 in a million chance of it succeeding. But we're now officially in uncharted waters. We simply don't know what's going to happen next.